Good morning, baseball fans, and welcome back to Dan's Vintage Baseball PC. Do not be fooled by the fancy name. It's just me and some friends talking about baseball cards. And today, a very special show, because I have two guests, not in the same room like the Brave show. I'm sorry, the Hank Aaron show, but two guests from two different coasts of the United States. Um, we have Mark Armour, who literally wrote the book, the Joe Cronin book, Joe Cronin Life in Baseball. You'll have plenty of links down below to see how you can purchase this terrific book. I can say so because I've read it. And my other guest is our old friend, Mark Hoyle, who was on the Tony Canigliaro show a couple weeks ago. So today, obviously, we're going to be talking about Joe Cronin. We'll talk about his bio since Mark wrote the book. And we'll also talk about his cards and memorabilia. So let me bring on, without any further ado, my two guests. Good morning, gentlemen. How are you? Oh, Mark, you're muted. Mark Armour is muted. There we
Hello,
go.
Dan. How are you doing?
Thanks, Mark, for agreeing to do the show. And I know this book was written in 2012, I think, was the release, or 2011.
10.
So it's a bit. It's due for a new edition, I think. So you can put everything we talk about from this show can go in the new one. So
Perfect.
I'm
Yeah.
happy to interview you for it. And Mark, welcome back from the Tony C show to the Joe C show.
Joe C, yeah. Been a couple weeks.
So let me see if I can do this, and my viewers will know that this is the first time I've had two guests on two different screens. So let me see if I can get this done correctly. All right, so that's pretty good. So Joe Cronin, as we know, was born in San Francisco in 1906. San Francisco in 1906 is kind of an important date, and I'll ask you about that, Mark Armour, shortly. And he passed away in 1984. Sacred Heart Cathedral Prep. There's a photo in Mark's book of, I believe it's the infield of that high school team, which is a classic. Joe was a thin 100% Irishman who played locally in San Francisco. He never did sign with the Seals. I believe he signed directly with the Red Sox, but we'll get into that. So I took some notes, which is cool. The reason that 1906 is important, I think, in San Francisco is that it's the year of the massive and terrible earthquake and the fires that happened thereafter. So my first note in my notes for you, Mark Armour, is earthquake. So tell us a little bit about Joe Cronin and the earthquake.
Sure. Well, Joe, I guess, missed the earthquake. The earthquake was in April. He was born in October, but it certainly affected everybody who lived in San Francisco. At the time that he was born, his family, who had lived in the Mission District, had been sort of resettled. They were living with relatives because they'd had so much damage to their house. So he was born in what ended up being sort of temporary place, and then he ended up in the house that he grew up in, which was a ways away from the big damage to the airport. And the whole city was affected. Everybody that lived in San Francisco for many years, and his father was somebody who spent his job during most of Joe's early life was doing what a lot of San Francisco men did at that time, which is to drive a team of horses and carry the debris from the center of the city into the bay or into the ocean to essentially dump it. So there's all this damage. It had to go somewhere, and it was basically just hard labor, and it took a few years to do this, and that was what Joe's father was doing. So the whole city was certainly affected by it, and it changed the reputation of San Francisco for many years afterwards. They had to deal with the fact that businesses didn't want to go there because it was considered to be a risky place to be, which is why the people who ran the city essentially wanted the story to be told that it was a fire, the fire that actually did all the damage. It was both. It was the earthquake that caused the fire, and then the fire essentially burned everything, a lot of the city down. But yeah, it was a big story in his life.
So Joe, interestingly enough, and I thought about this, he passed away in 1984, so he didn't get to see, only by a few years, the second major 20th century earthquake in San Francisco, the 1989. So he's sort of like right in the middle of the two of them, and good for him, he didn't see either one of them. Although, as you said, he certainly saw effects, that ripple throughout the city for years. So he signs directly with the Pirates, and
That's right.
he gets sent. I guess it's sort of there's like a sort of a rule, like a bonus baby kind of rule. That's interesting because later on in the 50s he's involved in repealing and then replacing the bonus baby rule. But anyway, so he gets to Pittsburgh and spends a couple of years there and doesn't really do much, and then he's sent down to Kansas City. And my next note is Joe Engel, because I think Joe Engel kind of saves Cronin's career there, and actually creates Cronin's career, both signing him for the Senators, but also introducing him to his wife, or the woman who would eventually be his wife. So tell me a little. I don't know. I never knew Joe Engel before I read the book, but tell me a little bit about Engel and how that sort of all transpired.
So Engel there used to be people like Joe Engel, maybe not too many, but people that were very, that had a lot of effect on baseball, but they did so in a minor league city. So he was in Chattanooga. I think the stadium for many years it was named after Engel, but he was a minor league guy who also did a lot of scouting for major league teams kind of on his own. He was just kind of a baseball guy that had various sources of income, and he just did this little scouting trip for Clark Griffith, who ran the Senators, and he was out in Kansas City and he saw Cronin, and he kind of wired back to Griffith, I think I have a shortstop, and Griffith basically said, fine, bring him home, and he basically got him on a train and he brought him to DC. So Engel was able to sign him himself without anyone else looking at him, and then drove to Washington and brought him into Griffith's office and said, here's Joe Cronin, here's the guy I wired you about. So it was kind of interesting because I was able to learn a lot of this research for this book was an education for myself. I didn't really know how all this stuff worked, but I had started to learn a little bit about how contracts sort of worked in the 1920s. And I mean, Joe bounced around a little bit, but he was in the big leagues and as a regular player by the time he was like 21 or 22. He signed so young that all this stuff happened when he was a teenager. So the story about his wife is that when he came into the office he met the woman who ended up being his wife, who was Griffith's niece, who was basically his personal assistant that kind of ran the office. But the story goes, and when I met Joe's daughter, a few years before I wrote the book, she had a scrapbook of all the stuff that was Joe's, which she did not give to me, but I did see it. There was multiple scrapbooks, and in one of them, she has a letter that Joe Engel sent to Maureen, the person who ended up being Maureen Cronin, that basically says, it's like a telegram. It says, on the way back home, I've got a husband for you. Something to that effect. And she brought him home. And sure enough, I mean, it wasn't quick. It took a few years before he, the two of them had the guts to sort of see what was happening. But, ultimately he ended up marrying her, and she survived him. And she was a big part of his life. I mean, he was a baseball guy, and he brought her everywhere. She went to all the meetings. that he went. I mean, she didn't sit in the room, but if there was a league meeting in Kansas City in the 70s, she went. And so everybody in baseball knew her. She was, at all the ball games that he was throughout the first ball at, she's right next to him. So yeah, big story.
When did she pass?
She passed in this century. It was like in 2003, 2002, something like that. When I met Maureen Cronin, who lives in West Palm Beach, I remember when I drove over there with my father because he lives in Sarasota, and we drove over to spend an afternoon with her. And it was very close to Mar-a-Lago where she lived, which I didn't know what that was at the time. But anyway, that's where she lives. And she said, "I wish you'd met my mom because my mom died like 2 years ago," and which I kind of wish I had too. And she said, she was very capable of holding a great conversation until very close to the end. So she died at like 98.
Yeah, he, as we can see here, made it to 77. I know one of the themes in the book is that he was not a drinker or a carouser, but he had a couple of vices, and one of them was food, and the other one was cigars. So I guess that combination kind of did him in. So he ends up. I know he played minor leagues. I guess it was Johnstown and New Haven, and then he was ultimately in Kansas City. But he joins Washington, and then I guess in 29, he becomes a regular. And my next note to you is 62 errors. I saw this number and I was like, 62 errors in one season? And then I did some research and I look back and I'm like, that has to be the record, and it's not even close. There's some guy in like 1903 who had like 100 errors in one season. So
I mean, there's a couple of problems. One of it is that he probably was. I mean, it probably was a bad season in some ways, but in other ways, people made a lot more errors back then. A lot more errors, like 3 or 4 times the number of errors there today. You can just imagine what the fields were like.
Yep.
I mean, now they're all like, all the fields are like, pool tables, and it didn't used to be that case. Even when the three of us were kids, I'm sure you can remember times when there were bad hops that ended up being a part of the game, right? Somebody reached on a bad hop single to left field, and there really are no bad hops anymore, or hardly any. I mean, it's a very unusual thing. So I'm not trying to excuse Joe. I think he probably did bobble a little bit too many that season, but I think probably the other guys who were playing shortstop probably had 40 errors.
Yeah, well, Appling, who sort of took over as, I guess he was the competition in terms of all-star teams. Appling led the league in errors like 4 years in a row. I checked that also. So Joe, 1930s his breakout season. Now he wins. Your book makes a reference to the MVP, which I guess wasn't really official at that point. But he wins like a sports writers MVP in 1930 because he has this phenomenal season.
So what it was, the baseball writers started their MVP award in 1930, and it works exactly the same way it does today. And after 1 year of doing it, Major League Baseball in 1931 said, "Okay, this is pretty good. We're going to make it official." So there's actually no difference between them, except that the first year MLB didn't like wave the wand and say, "Yes, this is something we'll recognize." But in every other way, it's on his Hall of Fame plaque. It says winner of the MVP in 1930. So
well, it's weird because Baseball Reference doesn't have it listed here, but they have MVP for guys in 1908, because I guess there was a different sort of MVP award at that point. I think it had a name to it actually. So anyway, Joe wins the MVP in 1930, 31. He's great, 32, and then in 1933, as a 26-year-old, he is appointed the manager of the Washington Senators, which at the age of 26, as their starting shortstop, I guess seemed a little weird. But you did a nice little bit of history into player managers and how they were significantly less common until the 1930s, when the owners were trying to save money by getting two salaries into one player. So, but I guess he was a good manager, because in 1933 they went to the World Series.
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to decide how good of a manager somebody is, like later. The biggest problem he had as a manager later when he got to the Red Sox was when they had a very veteran-filled team, and he was younger than them, right? So when he got to the Red Sox, he had guys like Lefty Grove who were notoriously difficult on managers, who
That's
basically told.
that's 2 notes from now.
Okay, well, I won't get into it, but in when he managed the Senators, they were all his. They were there was a young team, and Joe
Right.
was clearly the leader of the team, and I think everybody looked up to him, and I think there's a lot of stuff in there about how Joe's the difference, and
Yeah.
I'm a better player because of Joe, et cetera. So that was the kind of team he was probably the best with, was young teams, which he had later in Boston too.
Yep. And so 33, they lose the World Series, and I think it's 5 games. And then 34, they have a down year, and then Joe is sold / traded to Boston for the 35 season. So I guess it's something that we wouldn't even see today. I don't know, hard to say, but he's sold essentially because Griffith is running out of money and had a down year in 34, and the economy is in a depression, and so the other thing I think is a factor in this is that that's the year that he marries his wife, 35, 34. And so I don't know how much, I guess you could talk on this a little better, but I don't know how much of the move to Boston was to just kind of make it be that, like, he and his wife, who was a niece / daughter of the owner of the team, um, it wouldn't seem particularly kosher for him to continue to manage the team in that scenario. So, how does that whole thing transpire? That am I right about this?
Yeah, I think you are, but people wrote about this for the rest of Joe's life. This was a very common thing to write about, was that Joe, married the boss's. They used to say daughter. It wasn't his daughter; it was his niece. But people would say he married the boss's daughter or niece, and then Griffith sold him, right? So people would write about this and ask about this a lot. So there are three really things going on. One is that it was the Depression, and I'm sure that Griffith, could use. It was $250,000, which is $6 million in today's money, which I think would be it. Up until like the time I wrote the book, I made the case that it was still the largest sale of a player in baseball history, a simple sale. I think it's more complicated today because they attach money to contracts, and it's just a lot trickier to sort of judge that. But anyway, a lot of money. The other thing that's going on, of course, is that Tom Yawkey had just bought the Red Sox, and he was when he bought them a year earlier, he was this 30-year-old. He came into his money at age 30, and he was richer than anybody that had ever owned a baseball team before, all of which was family money. And he spent the rest of his life. I mean, baseball is all he really cared about. So
Yeah.
the story, which is probably an exaggeration, is that he said to Eddie Collins, who was his general manager, who's the best player in baseball, and Collins said Cronin, which is probably not true, but he said Cronin, and Yawkey said, go get him. And Cronin Collins basically said, well, I'm just going to keep raising the number until Griffith says yes. But Cronin was the funny story is that Cronin was actually on his honeymoon. So they got married in somewhere in DC. And it was I think it was a lavish affair. He was a well-known person, as was his wife. And for their honeymoon, they actually took a boat to San Francisco through the canal, and met. She had not met his family yet, and they went through there and they met Joe's family in San Francisco and his brother and other relatives. And while he was there, he got a cable essentially to call the office, and he found out he was traded there. So it was pretty. When you say it was right after he got married, yeah, it was like a week after he got married that he was traded. And whether that played into it, I don't know. The thing about Griffith is this was the only player he ever sold in his entire tenure, and he was kind of pretty proud of the fact that he didn't do that like Connie Mack did and other people. But they made him an incredible offer. He took the money. So I guess we'll never know precisely why he took the money, but they just kept raising the number, and he eventually said yes.
So you talk about Connie Mack, and my next note is Grove. Actually, my next three notes, two, Grove and Fox, both Philadelphia Athletics players who were purchased by the Red Sox with Mr. Yawkey's money. So I guess the period with the Red Sox that is not so great for Joe is 35 and 36 and part of 37 because of the problems with guys like Grove, who I have a Grove card back here that's in the front of my display because he's such an amazing pitcher. I didn't know that he was an asshole until I read your book.
Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know if he was an asshole or not, but he was somebody who had a tremendous pride in his ability, and he didn't think that Joe Cronin or other managers, frankly, he had trouble with Connie Mack too, although Mack was much older than him, and he did have a little bit more deference than he did with Joe, but he kind of he just didn't really think that Joe knew anything about pitching, which he probably didn't. So there are a lot of stories that people told it in that time that some of which I put in the book, where Grove would, be getting into a little bit of trouble, and Joe would, who was at shortstop, so he was just 100 feet away, would sort of walk into the mound, and Grove would basically say, "If you take one more step, I'm throwing this ball out of the ballpark," and Joe would kind of go back and turn around and walk back to his position. So. And they had Wes Farrell. They got around that same time, and Farrell was similar,
right.
That way. And they were, frankly, the two best pitchers that they had. Maybe the two best pitchers in the league. Honestly, they were both great pitchers. And Joe was. I think he had. I think it bothered him a lot. His play was affected, I think, in that period. But he righted himself later. But I think there was a couple years there where he had to sort of get through with his veteran team, especially those guys. Fox was more of a gentle guy, although he was a drinker. I think that was that always affected Fox. But I don't think he was I don't think he had any personal problems with Joe.
Yeah, they were just two very different people. Fox was a drinker and a carouser, and Joe was not. So Mark Hoyle,
Fox and Grove had made more money than Cronin? Think they were paid more?
I don't think they were. No, I think Cronin was probably like he was probably the bonus boy that got paid a lot. I mean they probably were pretty well paid. Yawkey paid his stars well, so I don't think any of them had any difficulty with that. But I think Cronin, a little bit like A-Rod, he had that tag with him for many years, like the $250,000 baby or whatever, because of the fact that Yawkey had paid this money for him, even though Cronin didn't pocket that money. But Cronin lived like a wealthy man for the rest of his life. He didn't really have any vices. He didn't really spend a lot of money. He didn't waste his money drinking or anything. So he always had big houses. The house he ended up with in Boston, in Newton, was a big house. So he lived a very conservative, um, always wore a tie and whatnot. And that's not what Grove was. That's not what Yaki was either. I mean, Yaki would bring all his players hunting. I don't think really Joe really cared about that.
So let's I'm going to show a little bit. This is part of my Joe Cronin collection, and we'll see most of these cards a little later. Mark Hoyle. So I do have only one of the three 1933 Gaudis, and we'll see the ones later. There is below that is the 1932 U.S. Caramel card, which I think I have, and I don't think you have, Mark Hoyle. So
I don't have that.
that one. Got you on
Yeah.
that one. So
Yeah.
those are the only two cards that I have of him as a Washington Senator. And then there's the 41 play ball and a 7, which I'm pretty happy about. Then there's the 46 propagandist Montiel, which 46, I guess he's a retired player at that point, right? It's 45 is his last year, Mark?
Yeah, so he was when I didn't mention this, but when he was sold to Boston, he continued to manage, of course, and he managed really for the rest of his playing career. So he was basically always the manager, and I think he would have retired sooner, but once the war started,
Yeah.
the number of able bodies that were around was shrinking every year, and I think by that time he was probably 30 pounds overweight, and it was difficult for him to probably play shortstop. He ended up moving and playing other positions, and then he became kind of a pinch hitter. And in 45, they had so few people that showed up. And that's the other thing, is they didn't know who was going to show up, right? It wasn't like today where you'd get on Twitter and you'd find out that Bobby Dorr got drafted. It was just, I wonder if Bobby Dorr is going to be here, when I go to the park. So he got there and he says, well, I guess I have to play in 45. And then just a few days into the season, he broke his leg on a play at Yankee Stadium, and never played again after that. I think he was out for the year. And then when 46 came, everybody came back, and then they didn't need him anymore. So that was that. So 45 was his last year that he that he took the field.
And then there's the two cards that I love. They're like my two favorite cards. They're the oversights. One is the National Chickle, and one is the Gowdy Wide Pen. And they're both from 1936, which ironically is probably the worst year of Joe's career, both as a player and a manager. And then we got two more, and then we'll get into Mark Hoyle in a second. So the one on the left is the 1939 Gowdy Premium, a card that I apparently paid too much for because I priced it out again last night. And then the photo on the right is Mark. You have a version of this in the photos in the middle of your book, and it says brace, which is cool because it says brace on the back of this one, so I know it's actually kind of legit. I remember where I bought it, but I don't know how it was advertised. I think that's 1939. Any clue if 39 is right on that one?
I don't know for sure, but that sounds about right. I would have said either 38 or 39 based on how he looks, especially.
And now we come to the creme de la creme, the Mark Hoyle collection. So one of the things about the controversies that come up in Cronin's time as a manager, one is the Pee Wee Reese controversy, which I think which I think he took a lot of crap for, and I think you sort of reduced that to it being not really an issue in the book, Mark, because Pee Wee Reese was actually the property of the Red Sox playing for Louisville, and then I guess he played a couple of games, and one of the games he didn't look all that great, and he was kind of a small player, and ultimately they ended up selling him, and people accused Cronin of doing that because he wanted to preserve his job, but they had Pesky also, so I mean that kind of the facts don't really bear that out in the long run. Any thoughts on that? Mark Hoyle, any thoughts on that?
Only one I've read, which Mark probably wrote about. He was sent down to scout him and he came back with a bad referral, if I remember it right.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why the story doesn't hold up that well for me is, and I have no, I have no, you'll just have to trust me. I have no reason to try and skew the answer here, but it just doesn't make any sense to me that this would have been a big deal at the time. It was a big deal later when Reese became a great player, but this was several years later. When Reese was a great player and Joe was no longer playing. But at the time, Joe was, the best shortstop in the American League, and Reese was a few years away from being, a good player. And when it was time for Joe to step away, he had a good year in '39, which is the year they sold Reese. He had a good year in '40. He had a good year in '41, and the next year, Pesky was there and he gave him the job. Right away. So it looks really like a productive transition. And then a couple years go by, Reese becomes a star, and then they start to write about like, hey, we used to have Reese. What's that all about? Whatever. I mean, the Red Sox, whether it was Joe or other people, made a mistake. If you have a guy like Pee Wee Reese and you sell him, that's a mistake. But it doesn't seem to me, looking into it, that it rises beyond all the other mistakes people have made throughout history, judging talent, right? I mean, every team trades people too early, and this was a case where, yeah, they misjudged it.
Yeah, Pesky, 42 had like 200 hits and led the league or something like that, and then everybody went for the war. And then 46, they came back and they acquired Vern Stevens, who proceeded to crush the ball year after year. So we've got so Mark, you have the 3 Gowdy rookies from 1933.
Yep.
And then there's the SGC 4. What is that? Is that
That's a 37 O-Pee-Chee.
Okay. And then you've got the 41 play ball, the 40 play ball. What's to the left of that?
That's a 36 worldwide gum.
Okay. And then there's the 2 double plays.
2 double plays
Where Joe is he's with Williams in one of them and he's with Fox in the other, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
Because we're at the point about now where Ted Williams is entering the scene quite loudly. And I did my show last week with my friend Matt. In fact, he's all of our friends, Matt, and looked at his collection. And I guess I did a lot of research on Ted Williams in the last few weeks, and then after reading Mark's book, I sort of feel that I know even a little bit more about Ted Williams. There's that beautiful scene at the beginning of the book where it's the retirement ceremony for Ted and Joe's numbers in a sort of down year for the Red Sox, and it's a rainy day, and it's like May, and Joe's sick, so he can't even come onto the field, and Ted says all these nice words about him. And then I flash back to like 39, 40, 41, 42, when Joe, like, time after time has to chide Williams for saying or doing something particularly offensive to fans or whoever, or writers mostly. That part of the book is kind of fun because Williams is a fun person to think about and talk about.
Well, I was actually at the game where they retired his number, the 2 numbers. I was there, and the game didn't actually finish. I mean, they didn't get to 4.5 innings. They got rained out in the 5th, and the Twins were ahead, and they were kind of mad that they called the game, but they did. They called the game. They did have the ceremony. Joe was ill. He ended up, he died, not later that year, and he didn't come down to the field where Ted did. But when I originally wrote the story, I had it sort of at the end of the book because I told the story chronologically, and then I decided that in many ways I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I mean, Ted Williams was a much more interesting person than Joe. That doesn't mean he's a better person, but he's much more interesting. This is why there's 50 biographies of Ted Williams, because he's just a fascinating dude. So I decided to pull him up front because I think their relationship says a lot about the two people. I mean, Joe was so, Joe was always had a suit and tie on, always held the door open for women, never cursed. And Ted was the opposite of all of that. And they loved each other. I mean, they truly loved each other. And I think Joe was I think he had some struggles with as a manager, like a lot of people do, but I think he was really great to Williams. I think he gave him just enough rope, and occasionally had to pull him in. And I think Ted would have been the first to admit, like, yeah, I was kind of a pain in the ass when I came up.
Yeah.
And later, and even in the 50s, when at that point Joe was the general manager of the team, and
Right.
Ted's got more controversies. I mean, as Mark can tell you, and as Matt could tell you, I mean, Ted Williams was 90% of the story in Boston the whole time he was there. He has all the oxygen on that team was him, and Joe was definitely the guy who was his almost like sidekick in the story, even though he's his boss. But I think anytime you can write a book and center a lot of it on Ted Williams, I think you're better off.
Well, there's that point where McCarthy becomes the manager, and he has certainly many flaws. But one of the things that Ted, I guess, liked about him is that McCarthy hated the writers just as much as Ted did, and he sort of protected Ted from the writers, whereas Cronin was, everybody's friend and talked about it and had writers on the field and all that kind of stuff. So I guess there was one point where Cronin wasn't Joe's friend as much as that he sort of gave the writers too much access to Ted, which was not good for Ted, I guess.
Right.
So we're on the right panel here. There's the 41 play ball in a slab.
That's actually a different play ball. That's a paper one.
Oh, that's right, the paper one. That's right. Yeah.
Paper one.
And it's authentic because it's hand cut, right?
Yeah, they came in two 12-card sheets. And the people cut them up.
And now below that is a team photo.
Right. That's actually that's a Gaudi Premium. It's a 35 309-2.
Okay.
Super tough to find, and he's the manager. I forgot where he is.
Is he in the circle?
He might be in this. I know that's Farrell in there. I'm not sure. I'd have to pull it out, but I know he's on that.
I see Grove. He's right below the circle there.
Yeah.
Is that Mo Berg on the bottom right?
I think Mo's in there. Yes, it is.
I think Joe is in the circle next to Farrell.
Yeah, you might be right. Yep, he's right in the middle.
So one of the themes in the book, which I think is good, is that Joe was extraordinarily loyal to guys. So you'll see, like Kyler is in like the 20s, and then he pops up again as a coach in the 40s. Heine Manouche is a player with him, and then he brings him to Boston, and then he makes him a manager. Mo Berg was, I guess, one of the guys who was with the Senators, and then followed Joe to the Red Sox. I guess loyalty is kind of a cool thing in baseball, and Joe had it in spades, right?
Yeah, he basically had. I mean, everybody was his friend, and he was friends with everybody. And I think I know when he became general manager, the writers would joke about this because he would call a press conference in like January, and all the writers would show up, and he would basically have nothing to say. He just kind of liked having people around to talk about baseball. and he would just say a couple of silly things like, we decided we're going to be going to camp in a few weeks, and we're all getting in shape, and that would be the whole thing. And they'd say like, why'd you got me out of my Christmas holiday shopping, and they would joke about the fact that whereas Williams, again, I always bring up Williams, the last out is made in game 154, and he's on an airplane to get out because he's going to he's going down to the Keys for the winter, and they don't hear about. He doesn't answer the phone. He doesn't answer letters until spring training.
There's that whole thing about how they couldn't get him to sign a contract because they couldn't find him.
Right. He didn't ever, and Joe never left. I mean, you always knew where Joe was because if there was there was always a banquet circuit back then. Like there'd be a banquet in Rochester and there'd be a banquet in Hanover, New Hampshire, and Joe would be as many of those as he could. He was up there on the head table and talking baseball. So yeah, much different.
So I skipped over this. There's a batter up there, which I guess is, and then the bottom left, is that also a batter up?
Yeah, there's two different colors of it.
Okay.
You can find a third color as well, like a greenish one.
And then there's the Propagandist Montiel up on the left there. I'm sorry, on the right. There's the Gaudy, the 36 Gaudy there, which I can't see. I know Joe is the field. They used the photo from his 33. I don't know who the other players are in it. And then the 1967 retired card from Venezuela.
Yep. There was a lot of red.
Yeah. Then there's so I actually should have put this one first because so you have the 236s that I showed just a short time ago, the Chickle and the Wide Pen. And then on the top right is the Sepia 39 Gaudy Premium. On the top left is, I think, is that a R312?
R316.
316. Okay. And who's the other player on there?
I think maybe Bucky Harris.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I think it's Bucky Harris.
Yeah, I think it is.
Yeah. Bucky Harris is a manager, right?
Yeah, they're both managers. Yeah.
Yeah, I pulled out Bucky Harris. I think this is a Wide Pen also. No, this is a Chickle from 36. Yep. Bucky Harris, who I guess was his first manager when he was a regular player. And then I guess Bucky went back to the Senators after Joe was traded / sold to Boston.
No, as a matter of fact, I think they might have switched jobs. I think Bucky Harris was the manager of the Red Sox at the time they acquired Cronin, and then Harris went back to Washington.
Yeah, I mean I think Bucky Harris is in the Hall of Fame, and I know.
Yeah, and basically as a manager, essentially.
And then Walter Johnson was his second. Well, not second because he had the Pittsburgh years, but he was his second manager in Washington. And Johnson, I think Joe kind of got some good early experiences with managers because Harris and Johnson were both pretty good managers, right?
Well, they were both really, calm, no nonsense baseball people, which is, I think, the people that Joe got along with the best. Not, I don't know. They weren't like the rowdy screamer kind of managers.
Right. And then there's the bottom right, Mark Hoyle. What is that?
That's it's a TCMA exhibit. I think they came out in 73 or 74.
It's a good photo. It looks serious there. Okay, so I know the bottom left is the exhibits. I think it's 36 exhibits 4 and 1.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, that's Grove? A 37 4 and 1.
37. Okay, Grove is in there, and is it Fox? And the bottom right, I'm not sure who that is.
It is. It's Fox. Yep.
Who's the bottom right?
Oh, I should know. I'm not sure. I can't make it out.
Okay. And then the upper left is a couple of photos.
Just a couple of photos from old baseball winter meetings. I think the top one is, and then the other one It's just Joe in uniform, Red Sox 30s.
So the upper left is Yawkey and Eddie Collins. So that was like their brain trust.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's a team in the
The
middle
team
top.
photo. That's a R311 36. This is a team photo, and he's right in the front row on that one.
And then there's like a drawing thing on the.
Yeah, that's a Bob Coyne drawing. It was probably in the Globe. I believe that's probably. I think I have it dated. That's late 30s.
And then the bottom right is another team photo.
That's another 1936 R311. That's the AL All-Star team, and Joe's right in front row.
Yes. So Cronin was in what, 7 All-Star teams, I think, over the years, which kind of hurt him that the All-Star game didn't start until his career had already gotten underway.
Yeah, midway through it.
Probably would have made about 10 otherwise.
Probably one of the more famous All-Star games ever. Joe was played an interesting part in, and that was the second All-Star game when Carl Hubble struck out 5 guys. Cronin was the 5th of those, but also interesting about that was that Joe was the American League manager in the game because they were the defending champs, and the American League won the game. So even though Hubble is the story, the American League was the winning team in the game.
Yeah, there's a little anecdote where Joe was bragging that he hit a foul ball off of Hubble. I think he was the only one who made any contact.
Yeah.
So my next note, and we'll get into this in a little bit because we got some things that are advanced here. My next little thing is the war, because a lot of my collection is either before, a little bit before, a little after World War II. So a lot of my videos, there's always some World War II thing going on. And Joe didn't serve because I guess he was a little bit older, but he did certainly do a lot for the war effort. Can you talk a little bit about that, Mark?
Yeah, he did a lot of stuff locally, and then I kind of dusting off my memory. I think in the winter of 44, 45, I think he went to the Pacific and talked to the troops essentially with another group of people. So he was there. He never, I think, I mean, Joe, and I think this is true of a lot of people at that time. I think Joe would have been one of the first people to serve. I think that's just like the kind of person that he was. He was just he was very much a pro-America guy. He was old. I don't know that he would have passed the physical by then. He was a little chunky.
Yeah.
But the people who played got a lot of criticism because it's like, well, they had these 4 Fs, which would be people that weren't ineligible to be drafted. But the writers or some writers would write like, well, if you can play Major League Baseball, there has to be something you can do in the service, right? And basically, they kept putting guys in, but the people who were left were always, you had to have some people left, I guess, because you couldn't put everybody in the service.
Was it Pesky or Bobby Dorr who had like some sort of ear issue that made him a 4F?
I'm not sure, but Dorr was late. Dorr played into 44.
Right.
Pesky and Williams went in earlier. Of course, Williams got a lot of flack for not going in earlier, and he, because he was taking care of his mom, but he was, Ted being Ted, he was pretty stubborn about it, right? He wasn't going to say the right things. He was just like, I'll go in when I damn well feel like it.
Well, the irony, and I actually did some research on this, is that Ted, this was like one of the great things that he did in his life was that he took such good care of his mother that he played 42 and gave all his money to his mother in her annuity and took care of her before he went in. So he was being criticized for actually doing something which was bold. And then of course Ted, did all of his time in World War II and then the Korean War. So to say that Ted wasn't, ironically enough, to say that Ted wasn't dedicated to his company, to his country, was kind of ridiculous. But So my next note is 1946, which I know both of you probably have some pretty strong opinions on because it's both an amazing season and a heartbreaking season in the end. The Red Sox dominate the American League. They get Stevens to play shortstop. He crushes the ball and has like 148 RBIs. Pesky settles in at third. The pitchers are all back. Ted is back. Ted wins the MVP, I believe, in 46. And then they clinch too early and then sit around waiting for the Cardinals and the Dodgers to play a 3-game series because they tied at the end of the year. And then the 1946 World Series takes place. And Joe took a little bit of heat, I guess, for his pitching decisions, who he used in certain games. And there was the reliever in Game 7, whose name escapes me. The left-handed reliever who he brought in Game 7 for Slaughter's
I can't think of his name.
first to home.
Damn it. Yeah. I'm trying to think of it too. And I wrote about it, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, I've written a lot about the even before the Cronin book about those late 40s teams. And I think that those teams were great teams, full stop. And I was pretty early on the bandwagon of like the postseason is just so hard to predict. I think that they were a legitimately great team in 46, despite losing the World Series. I think they were great in 48 and 49. And I feel the same way about like the 20th century, the 21st century teams. A couple things go wrong and they lose those World Series, and people talk about them differently too. I mean, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. I think the Red Sox were a little bit snake bit for some of those seasons, and then they've made up for that in the last 20 years by having the ball go their way time after time in the postseason. Yeah. So it's like I think they were a great team, and 46 they just you kind of saw it coming because their team was getting better and better before the war. They had this really great core of people, all of whom missed 3 years. Well, Dora missed 1.5 years. And then they all came back. And of course, no one knew what was going to happen with the guys that were coming back. And it turns out that they were just as good as ever. I mean, Williams was as good as ever. Pesky was as good as ever. Dor, they had a great team. And
Dom. We didn't.
Dom
DiMaggio.
And Dom, and I didn't mention Dom. Yeah, and Dom was great before and after the war. And if you look at their stats for all those 4 guys, it's hard to see that that there was any degradation of their talent, which is really kind of funny now to think about. Like you just, I mean, some of them were playing, a little bit, but I mean, I don't know, it can't be the same. But they had great teams. Joe was finally just a manager. He didn't retire, so there was always they would always ask him, like, you think he might come back? And he says, well, we'll see what happens. So I think he considered himself ready if like Pesky had gotten hurt or something. But I think he preferred not to have to play, and he did.
Yeah, I think he kept gaining some weight at that point too.
Yeah.
So he wasn't really even in playing shape. Although, there's a couple of points in the book where he's in his 220s pound wise, and then he goes on a massive workout and diet, and he shows up at 180 pounds in camp. I was like, dude, can you get me the Joe Cronin diet? Because I could use that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I try not to overdo this, but he just had he had really quite a work ethic. I mean, you could argue that another way to put it is he didn't really have a life. He didn't have much else that he did. So he just worked out all the time. And in the winter in San Francisco, he would, I mean, it's almost like he ate the first half of the winter and he worked out the second half of the winter to try and get it all back. But it was a lot of stuff like running in the parks and, climbing mountains, and, he didn't have any weights or anything like that back then. But yeah, if you see pictures of him in his prime, he looks chiseled, right? He's not a thin shortstop. He's a big guy. He was always like with a big chest, big shoulders. He's a power hitter. And then, I think as he backed away, and I think, being a manager is probably takes away quite a bit from your ability to work out during the season. I think it started to be harder and harder for him to not put on weight, because I think he ate a lot and he worked out a lot. And once he took that second part away, I think that he just started to put it on.
All right. So the pictures here, there's a lot of pictures here. The top right photo where Joe's got his hair nice and
Yeah.
what is that?
That is that's a cutout, a stamp from the Washington Herald, and these were put out between 36 and 38, and numerous newspapers all over the country did this. So you can find these I have a couple that have Boston, headlines on them. There's a couple Chicago ones. You can find just about every newspaper did this for each team, and that's backed up by a piece of cardboard just glued to it. So pretty rudimentary collectible, but they are checklisted. You can find them.
And then there's a matchbook of some
The
kind.
matchbook is from '59, and it was a set of matchbooks that came out. I don't know, it might be 30 or 32 of them, and it's all old Washington Senators.
Ah, okay.
So this was well after he was associated with them, but him being a legend playing and managing there, they stuck him on. So,
and then we've got his plaque.
Yeah.
Is
I
that
think
signed?
the card next to that, Mark, you gave me that. That's signed by him. I think
The
you might have
T-
sent
it's-
that to me.
TCMA, right? Is that what
That's a
that is?
TCMA, yeah, yep.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I did.
There you
And
go.
the other card, the plaque, I got that at Paul's shop down in Newport.
Oh, our friend Paul.
Yes.
Gave him a shout out. I saw him at the Philly show.
And if you notice the top one there's a bookmark from Mark's book.
I will. I'll show you mine.
Which everybody should go and buy.
always showing. Got to pass those bookmarks out.
Well, the cool thing about your book and you and me,
it's
Mark,
a great bookmark.
You handed me your book in a coffee shop in Cooperstown, so I can't get any more cool than that. So
no, that was good. That's where we met. I love being able to have an origin story like you and I have, and Jason is the same thing. I met him in Cooperstown that weekend, so it's like can always place you. I met Matt in Cooperstown too a couple years later.
Nice. Mark Hoyle, did you get the signature version? Because
of course I did. You signed it right in front of me for me.
All right,
yes.
There you go. All right.
Yes.
I got the Mark Hoyle auto now. I'm sorry, the Mark Armour. I knew I was going to do that eventually. I was gonna mix it up. All right, So I know there's a backstory between the two of you on this, which is cool. But let me just find out what these are first.
So there was Joe. I know this is getting ahead, but he essentially retired sort of as an active part of baseball. Because he had been the president of the American League in like 73 or 74, and then he had 10 more years where he was just like the honored old Joe Cronin that would show up at banquets and stuff. And by 83, he was. He had cancer and he was not out and about as much. And some group decided to put on this big banquet for Joe in Boston. I think it was at the Sheraton. It was like in November. So it's in the off season. It was a Joe Cronin night. And I had no idea that this had happened. I don't remember hearing about it at the time. I lived nearby. And, but everybody came. I mean, like DiMaggio came, but also like Willie Mays came and Hank Aaron came. It's hard to imagine such a banquet existing today without 1,000 photographers. But you had all these people come into Boston, Logan Airport, driving over to this hotel, spending the weekend, going to this banquet. And the people who went to the banquet got these. Well, actually, I'm not sure. These you can't really tell from this, but these are essentially poster size things that you have to roll up because they're really good size. And these essentially are advertising that event that happened that weekend. And all these people that are shown here were there. You can see Sandy Koufax was there, Al Kaline, Brooks Robinson. They all came into town to honor Joe Cronin, and they put out these two things, which I think are really cool.
These are amazing. The players on
Yeah.
here, just the people on here. It's just like, it says something about Joe as a person,
Yeah.
but also, as a baseball person, but also as a person. That all these people would come together and come into the city. And I see Spawn over there.
I think it was actually a Jimmy Fund event. I'm looking at the poster right now, and it says, sponsored by Jimmy Fund. It's on the
Looks like
very
it
top.
was. So it was probably also a fundraiser. And Joe was a big Jimmy Fund guy, as most of the big Boston people were. Certainly Ted was.
Yep.
That was certainly a big part of his what he did the last 30 years of his life.
So how did Mark Hoyle has these in his possession? How'd you get them, Mark?
I was gifted these by Mark. He found these in Baseball Nostalgia in Cooperstown, brought them all the way back home with him to the West Coast, and then mailed them all back to me a couple years later. And now I have them framed over here.
Well,
so knowing Mark as I have, and I count myself very fortunate. Mark has a tremendous collection. He posts about it a lot, and he's got a room. He's got wall space and everything. And I love my collection too. I'm not trying to compare them, but I just didn't see a place for these. The thing about these is they're pretty big, right? So you need to have like a wall, or otherwise they were in my closet. They were like rolled up in my closet, and they're
20 inches by 2 feet. So
so they're, I kept them in great shape and everything, but I just thought, like, Mark, who would use these actually? And Mark is the person who's most likely to actually use them. So they're in a good home.
Yes, they are.
This is one of the great things about this community of people that I've been fortunate enough to be involved with the past several years is that we kind of look out for each other. I think that I almost think of Mark's collection as partly mine because he shows it off and I get to see it. And so if I'm helping his room, then I'm helping myself, and I'm hoping somebody to visit it.
Yes. Everybody has an open invite. So
all right. Let's get out the date books then. So all right. These are amazing for so many reasons, and I just want to know exactly what they are.
These are, the top advertisement, that's what for a Joe Cronin glove. That's like out of an old, like Reach periodical that, they preview the year, like Sporting News type digest. And the other two, they came out of like the Spalding guides.
Uh-huh.
And each team had a page like that. And Joe is the manager on both of these, although he's swinging a bat in the top one. But they put these out every year for every team. And I found a bunch of these at a show. A guy had all the Boston ones, so I just grabbed those. I love the old advertising anyway. I have a whole binder full of it.
Yeah, that the one on the far right, which is the larger one, which looks kind of is that poster size or it's just?
No, those are all. They're basically maybe 6 by 9. They're all pretty small. That just happens to be blown up. It's the same size as the other one.
Yeah, I would spend like hours looking at that and reading about all the players and looking
at full of those. Yeah,
it's one of those ones that's right out of my wheelhouse. So, right in my wheelhouse. So the far right is the doubleheader pin.
Yep. And the other one's from 38. It's called Our National Game.
Uh-huh. And then I guess what's sort of a little shrine there.
That's a Joe Cronin Hall of Fame bust.
Okay.
Those were put out in 63. If you can find the box, there's a cool checklist on the back, but I I don't think they were licensed by the Hall of Fame, so I think they got kind of shut off from selling these. They only came out
Who put him
one
out?
year. I don't know who put them out.
There's like a little plaque below him there, right?
Yeah, there's
Is that
Jimmy
what?
Fox is in the set, Trish Speaker, Babe Ruth, all those guys. Honus Wagner. It's a pretty cool set. 1963.
Nice. And then we got, okay, I think this is the last. Yeah, this is the last slide.
These are Christmas cards. When Joe was the president of the American League, he would send these out to the teams. His little names in there. He didn't sign any of these, so those are from, I think, 65, 67, and 64. And he would mail those out to the teams on Christmas.
So we're a little bit over an hour, but I have two more little notes here. One is rule book, which I found fascinating, something that I didn't know at all, which is that Joe Cronin was instrumental in rewriting the Major League Baseball rule book, which I guess hadn't been updated in decades. Mark, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so it was 1950. One of the things about Joe, which maybe is obvious if you've listened to this, is that he was, even before at the time, he was the general manager of the Red Sox, but he was also on like all of the committees. And I think if you ever worked with people that just raise their hand, like, I'll help with that. And I think Joe was that. Was like, if you go through the sporting news looking for Joe Cronin, there would be some committee that was called like the disaster committee, and they had to come up with a plan, like what happens if the Red Sox plane crashes and everybody dies. They had a plan for all this, and Joe would be on that committee. Or what happens? We're negotiating a new World Series radio contract. Joe's on that committee too. So with the rules committee, they got Joe to be on the committee. I think he was the chairman of the committee. Years had gone by, and everybody was just dissatisfied with the rule book, which I think had just evolved from the 19th century, a little bit at a time. And they decided to streamline it and start from the beginning. And they wrote an entirely new rule book, which is essentially the rule book we have today. And that you start with, the object of the game is to score more runs than the other team. I mean, it really starts with the basics, right? And works their way up into what's an inning, what's an out, the whole thing. And Joe was the guy. And I think he was more the manager of the process than he was the guy that was like doing the writing. I think he was just because there were umpires on the committee and whatnot. One of the things that because people would ask him, like, what specifically what was the role? What were the things that you really weighed in on? And one of them was there was a lot of pressure to, and this goes up to the present day. There was a lot of pressure to remove takeout slides because people were getting hurt. And Joe, being an old middle infielder, I think he was very protective of the fact that baseball was a contact sport. He didn't like the idea that people wanted to take that out of the game. So he sort of was the guy who pushed back and left and didn't want those rules changed. So if you see Hal McRae's takeout slide of Willie Randolph on YouTube, which is one of the coolest things on YouTube. Honestly,
not if you were a Yankee fan watching that game live, as I was.
It is just impossible to believe that this actually happened. No call. And that was Joe. That's the baseball that Joe wanted, I think. That was years later, but he was that guy. But yeah, he was involved in that in 1950.
So the last note I have, and it's a little bit of a touchy subject, and you're both knowledgeable in this, is my last word on my notes is integration. And so the book talks about the tryout, which was held in 1945 in Fenway Park with Jackie Robinson and Sam Jethro and a third player whose name escapes me now. And then the Red Sox didn't really have, Pumpsie Green doesn't become the first Red Sox African American player until I believe 1957, which
59.
59. Okay, and they signed multiple players, including the great pitcher Earl Wilson, and they signed several other players, and they had issues with the minor leagues because two of their major minor league franchises were in the South. They spent a lot of time giving large chunks of money to high school and college players who never panned out. So there's a whole host of reasons why the Red Sox were the last Major League Baseball team to integrate. So I just wanted you both to have an opportunity to discuss that in the way that you choose to.
Well,
Go
you
ahead,
can
Mark.
start, Mark.
Well,
Okay.
I was going to say, at that tryout, who was there? Was Eddie Collins was there with Cronin? I think
Yeah,
a lot
Cronin was there. See, one of the things I tried to do with this was what I try to do with everything is like tell the story, right? Exactly what happened, because this is a story that's been mistold so many times in terms of like who yelled what and whatnot. And I tried to like get the facts straight first, and then try and figure out like why did this all happen this way. And with the tryout itself, I know where Cronin was because Wendell Smith, who was the writer for the Chicago Defender, who's one of the people who brought the people there, sat with Cronin at the tryout, and he wrote about it in the next day's paper. So I'm 100% sure that Cronin was there in the stands with Wendell Smith, sitting together, watching this tryout. And Wendell Smith talked about like exactly what Joe was saying, which is these guys are obviously good players. There was no, and many years later, like I believe in 1979, so 34 years after the tryout, a guy wrote in the Boston. It was either written in the Boston Globe or was talked about on a Boston talk show that somebody yelled, "Get those N words off the field." It never came up in the 34 years before that. And I think there's a lot of reason, even from the people who are the most anti Red Sox from this period, a lot of people have said like, I doubt that this actually happened.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't have escaped the attention, including of Wendell Smith. Like there's no way that Wendell Smith wouldn't have written about it. There's no way Jackie Robinson, who was extremely bitter about this, wouldn't have talked about it. So I think the story with the Red Sox is how much of this was just an error in judgment and how much of this was racism. In 1945, no one was signing black players. So what it would have taken for the Red Sox to do this would have been some act of both courage and also like almost like aggressive civil rights action. It would have been like, and they absolutely did not have the gonads for that. There's no question they were not going to be first. That just isn't who they were. They being Yawkey, Collins, Cronin. And then after a few years, it no longer took really. You weren't sticking your neck out 3 or 4 years later, because now at that point other people are playing, and now you're actually. It's now becoming, certainly by 55 or so, it was becoming like, what the hell is going on here? Because they didn't have a guy. And it is hard to say exactly what happened, exactly who was the person that was the problem, if there was a person who was the problem, if there was one person there's the problem, but there's no question that it did tremendous damage to the organization. I don't think it's a coincidence at all that in the 1950s, I have graphs in there where I describe the talent that was coming into the game. I mean, people know the story, but I tried to make it visually, I tried to visually prove it, of the value that was coming into the game. And the Red Sox were not signing those players, and they slowly were being sucked down to the bottom of the league, right? They were one of the best franchises in baseball at the start of the decade. and they were the worst franchise in baseball at the end of the decade. So there's no question that this did tremendous damage, and that Joe Cronin's job in the 1950s was to bring talent into the organization. He's the general manager of the team. So from a pure baseball point of view, this is a big failure, right? This is the largest collection of readily available talent in baseball history, and the Red Sox did not bring any of it in, and they had more money than every other team as well. So big F. How much of that was because we don't want to have any black players? How much of it was just short-sightedness of like, we're going to go after these bonus babies? That's where we think the money is, or that's where we think the value is, which obviously proved to be completely wrong. I mean, they signed guys. They signed like Frank Baumann for $100,000. They could have gotten, instead of Baumann, they could have gotten, Aaron, Banks, Clemente. They could have signed like 5 other guys
or
that same amount of money.
Sam Jethro. Jethro ended up playing in Boston. So
Yes.
I don't think Boston was the problem.
Right.
Jethro.
No, I don't think Boston was the problem either. And Cronin's story is that in the meantime that this was going on, so in the 1950s, he's winning like awards in Boston for his commitment to, inner city inclusiveness. And he's winning, like he got some big award from B'nai B'rith for the fact that he was so, he ran these camps for underprivileged kids and all this stuff. And then in 1965, of course, he signed the first African-American umpire when he was running the American League.
Yep.
So he's got this sort of complicated story, and whether Yawkey told him not to, or he just said, I'm going to outsmart people by doing it this way instead. I don't know what it was, but I think I'm sure Mark would agree with this. It would be like, I really wish it wasn't true of our team, because it's a story that we've had to, I probably had to answer for it like directly from people over my whole life.
Definitely.
Right? It's this big black mark.
Yep. Well said.
The only thing I think your book does pretty much exonerate Joe Cronin personally. Not just because he made the wrong decisions. They weren't racially motivated decisions. He went after bonus babies. He signed guys out of college and all that stuff. But also, Joe Cronin was the president of the American League during a period where probably the greatest period of African American players making a mark on the game throughout the 1960s and 70s. So, and nothing in his life or his career indicates that he had any racial animosity. So I think that your book does a pretty good job of removing Joe as the problem there. So, it is a black mark. I'm not sure if it's something that can be explained in 10 minutes on a YouTube podcast, but we did our best.
Well, there's no smoking gun like there is with in the NFL, like the guy that ran the Redskins, who was the last team to integrate. He has public comments where he basically says, we don't want to sign any black players. There's no smoking gun. There's no smoking gun for Yawkey either. Yeah. Right? Yawkey never said the wrong thing.
Yeah, neither, Eddie Collins, I don't think really even necessarily is the problem. Pinky Higgins might have been a problem, but by then it was the mid 50s, so at that point they sort of missed the boat.
Pinky Higgins very much could have been the problem. Yeah, and they also this there's bad luck that happens along the way. This was in the newspapers that they were trying to purchase. This is by the 50s, the Red Sox believed in purchasing people more than they believed in sort of signing an 18-year-old and having him work his way through the system. They tried to purchase Charlie Neal from the Dodgers. Buzzy Bavasi talked about that. And they didn't want to do it. they tried to purchase Al Smith from the Indians, and they weren't able to get that done. They had Earl Wilson, who was set to make the team in 1957, and he was drafted into the Army, and he spent 2 years in the Army. So, things happen. There's no question they were late, though.
Yeah.
All right. I don't know what just happened there, but I had a little glitch. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have to wrap it up. This has been amazing, illuminating, educational, and really thank you so much, both of you, for your incredible insights, materials, etc. Mark Armour, thanks again for the book.
Sure.
I will link it below. It is a fantastic book. And
Appreciate
Mark
that.
Hoyle, thanks again for your amazing collection and all of the things that you provide. So
thank you for having me. I was just here to show the pretty pictures. Mark tells the story. So
well, I was just going to say, if you come up with another reason to have the three of us talk, then it won't be difficult to talk me into it.
I appreciate that, and I do understand, Mark Hoyle, that we spent a lot of time talking about the book, but the book is awesome. But we also did go through your stuff, and I love that too. And I would absolutely 100% love the both of you to come on again when the subject and the situation arises. So, gentlemen, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you very much. Viewers, tune in next week for the show about Carl Furillo. So, great time. Talk to you guys soon.